His element was water, for he placed his dynasty, which was to have ruled for 10,000 times 10,000 years, under the protection of this natural force. He was the greatest, greater than any ruler before him, lord of everything under the sky. He conquered and pacified the land between the four seas. In the year 221 BC, he appointed himself the first exalted emperor of Qin. He was Quin Shin Huangdi, the first emperor of China. The historian who would later write about his life came from an opposing school of political thought. Although he reported about the construction of the emperor's grave, he neglected to mention the famous terracotta army. Why was this? He described the emperor as a megalomaniac tyrant who had allowed himself to be deceived by charlatans in his quest for the elixir of life. The more than 7,000 life-size terracotta figures are clear evidence that our picture of China's first emperor is incomplete and mistaken. More than 30 emperors lie buried here near the former capital Xi'an, under the dusty yellow soil steeped in history. But none of these burial mounds excites as much interest and curiosity as that of the first emperor. For thousands of years, historians and writers have speculated about what this subterranean necropolis might contain. There's talk of immense treasures, but also of lethal traps and poison. At the age of 13, shortly after his coronation as king of the small state of Qin in 246 BC, he ordered construction to begin on an immense structure which would rival that of the Egyptian pyramids in size. 700,000 farmers were drafted in from every corner of the land to work day and night as slave laborers on the huge site. Anyone who refused was killed. Is this the reason why China's first historian, Sima Chen, well informed though he was, made no mention of the terracotta army? The grave was to be a model of the entire world over which he had ruled. Will this one day provide us with a new picture of the first emperor? Or does the surprise discovery of the terracotta army indicate that the man who'd won the wars of unification intended it only as a further memorial to himself as conqueror and unifier of the kingdom? Armies up to 1 million strong faced each other in battle. Within 10 years, he had conquered the states of Han, Zhao, Yan, Wei, Chu, and Qi. During the 250 years called the period of the Warring States, these states had battled for dominance. In 221 BC, they were united as the Great Qin Empire. His incomparable successes were achieved by the use of new forms of warfare, vast armies in which the infantry and cavalry fought in a single formation, effective siege tactics, and significantly superior weaponry. At least equally decisive was the fact that courage and bravery were richly rewarded in the Qin Empire, and that the entire military system had only one purpose: attack. The construction of a 5,000-kilometer-long Great Wall made the first emperor famous throughout the world. It also kept the Middle Kingdom fatefully isolated for thousands of years. The wall should have taken just as important a place in his grave as the standardized weights and measures he introduced and the new uniform coins he had minted. The form of writing he imposed throughout the huge empire has not changed in structure to the present day. The name of his empire, Qin, is the origin of our word China. In crowning himself first divine emperor of Qin, he had indeed unified the empire for the first time, but war had taken a heavy toll. 1,650,000 enemy soldiers had lost their lives in the fighting. But for the emperor, it was the highlight of his life. He had fulfilled his forefathers' dream and created a huge unified China. When just 10 years later a meteorite landed near the former capital, the divine emperor panicked. Since time immemorial, shooting stars had always been the sign of impending doom. Wild rumors circulated. Fear, superstition, and an obsession with magic were to determine the emperor's policies. Malcontents chiseled the words, "Quin Shin Huangdi will die and his kingdom will collapse," into the meteorite. The court of the divine emperor was shrouded in anxious silence. The incident was never discussed. The youngest of his more than 3,000 concubines, the innocent ones, were made to walk through the palace from morning to night singing about immortality. Few people saw the emperor anymore. Priests and fortune tellers were the only people he still trusted. They explained the bad omen. The spirits were jealous of his powers. Thereafter, Quin Shin Huangdi would only walk through covered passageways, and no one was allowed to divulge his whereabouts, on pain of death. The inscription on the meteorite seems to have made a deep impression on him because he reacted with excessive brutality. Since he could not find the culprit, he had the offensive object ground down and everyone living within a 20-kilometer radius executed. The rivers ran red with blood. After this episode, the emperor approached his shamans for advice, as he had so often. In this period of his life, they were the only link between the ruler and his empire, and they had a good understanding of both his fears and the mood of the people. But the Tiger of Qin, as he had once respectively been known by his adversaries, had cut himself off for too long. Unrest was growing throughout the empire. In the easternmost parts, even signs were reported that heralded the ascent of a new ruler. The emperor ordered incense to be burnt and prayers said in all the temples of the land in order to avert disaster. The oracle was consulted. The answer is suitably vague. The first historian, Sima Chen, recorded it for posterity. Movement and travel are good. The emperor therefore decided to undertake a tour of inspection. This book describes 3,000 years of Chinese history before the Common Era. Its author, Sima Chen, was born 65 years after the death of the first emperor. Even as a boy, he collected everything he could find about the Qin dynasty. So did he, a Confucian, want to take revenge on the man who had had 460 Confucian intellectuals buried alive? The fifth tour of inspection is discussed in particular detail. The emperor's retinue was like an army setting off to battle. Every curious bystander could see why the emperor needed to be accompanied by 60,000 people. He had to demonstrate his authority in the face of growing unrest. The day's route was not announced before morning. Few knew their exact itinerary, and nobody knew in which carriage the emperor was to be found, or whether he really was in the luxurious state coach specially built for the journey. We know exactly what this coach looked like because a bronze model of it has been found. It was a comfortable vehicle made for travelling in which its occupants could sit or lie down undisturbed. The door could be locked from the inside and there were barred windows at the front and on each side. Extensive tours of inspection of this magnitude were only possible because the divine emperor had had an extensive road network built. This was larger than that of the entire Roman Empire. Some of these roads, made of tamped earth, are said to have been 70 meters wide and were so well constructed that parts of them can still be found today, more than 2,000 years later. Yao Shengmin has published a book on the road network during the Qin period.
There are traces here of a road from the Qin period. It's the main highway that led to the northern border. This section is the only possible link between two former palaces. The widest section of this part of the road is 15 meters wide. The narrowest just 2 meters.
The organizers of the tour of inspection faced almost insurmountable problems. For security reasons, the route had to be planned so that every evening the party reached one of the numerous palaces the emperor had built for himself all over the empire. They were always greeted by a crowd of curious onlookers. Although the entire country lived in poverty, scores of well-dressed women lined the roadside, hoping to become one of the emperor's horde of concubines. Local civil servants and dignitaries would hurry out to meet their emperor, clutching reports, taxes, and petitions to the emperor. This is the oldest existing picture of a tour of inspection and can be found in a temple at the foot of the sacred Mount Taishan. It's almost 1,000 years old and depicts a journey made by the mountain god. The whole enterprise was born of fear. Its purpose soon became clear: to suppress rising unrest. The journey first led to the southeast, into the former kingdom of Chu. Its people had never fully accepted subjugation, and there were frequent uprisings. Even today, the area contains some of the finest attractions in all of China. Mount Guang, whose mist-shrouded peak is one of the most popular themes of Chinese landscape art. And the famous ornamental gates at Shixian, though these were built long after the reign of the first emperor. Because Quin Shin Huangdi was afraid of attacks and assassination attempts wherever he went, the entire route was secured by his soldiers and guards. He had good reason to be cautious. By now he was hated throughout the empire as a tyrant and had already been lucky to escape 3 attempts on his life. The first assassination attempt was particularly notorious. It was recorded both by Sima Qian and the oldest surviving Chinese novella, as well as being carved in stone. The year was 227 BC, 6 years before the King of Qin was proclaimed ruler of the world. The attack was carried out by Jing Ke, the bravest man of his time, in an attempt to save the small fiefdom of Yan, near today's Beijing, from conquest by the kingdom of Qin. Jing Ke and his companion Wu Yang went to the royal court of Qin to present him with the head of his mortal enemy and a map of Yan as if submitting to him. The novella recounts,
Wu Yang was very frightened. His face became deathly pale and he fainted. Jing Ke apologized. May your majesty grant him a little time so that I can finish what I came here for. Jing Ke may rise, the king said, and present the map. Jing Ke unrolled the map in which he'd concealed a dagger. He grabbed the king's sleeve and with his right hand he pointed the dagger at his chest, saying, "You have been a threat to Yan's state and all the lands between the 4 seas for too long. Who knows if you will ever be satisfied with your conquests? I, Jing Ke, shall now take revenge on behalf of the whole country. If you leave Yan in peace, you shall live. If not, you will die." But the king turned his sword round, drew it, freed himself from Jinke's grasp, and leapt over a screen to flee. Thereupon, Jinke took his dagger and threw it at the king. The dagger sliced off one of his ears and hit a bronze pillar, sending out a shower of sparks. The king at once turned round and cut off both of Jinke's hands. Jinke leant against a pillar and, sitting stretched out on the ground, continued to revile the king. Woe that the country has not been avenged, that my venture has failed.
Why should anyone have wanted to kill an emperor who had created the basis for a kingdom that would last for over 2,000 years? Parts of his Great Wall still exist today. It's a symbol and expression of an everlasting China, but it's said the wall was constructed amid unimaginable human suffering. Quin Shin Huangdi had the first great wall of the Qin period constructed using parts of existing walls from the 6 conquered states. Sources from the 6th and 7th centuries AD say the work was carried out by between 1 and 2 million peasants and prisoners. Fields were left unattended, entire regions lay fallow, starvation spread. The first emperor levied very high taxes in money and in kind. For example, he demanded half the crops as grain tax to help fund the construction of the wall. Entire armies of peasants and prisoners were set to work on the project, slaving and dying in the mountains and deserts of the northern border. The wall was to run from the deserts of Gansu province to the East China Sea, but work on the biggest graveyard in the world was never completed. The sections we can see today stem mainly from the end of the 17th century. Throughout China, people tell the story of Meng Jiannu, the widow of a press-ganged teacher who died as a result of the harsh working conditions, and whose body was buried by the Great Wall. Her search for his mortal remains attracted the admiration of the first emperor. This woman, whose fondest wish was to give her husband a decent burial, apparently agreed to join the emperor's court as one of his concubines. But the moment her husband's remains were found and given a state funeral, she threw herself into the ocean to be united with her husband in death. To this day, she's honored in a temple on the shores of the East China Sea. An inscription reads,
Meng Jiannu is not dead, for thousands of generations will keep her memory alive. But where is Quin Shin Huangdi? Only hatred remains of his great wall.
Professor He, the most eminent Chinese historian on the Qin period, interprets this legend thus.
Meng Jiannu did exist, but before the first emperor, during the spring and autumn periods of the Qin kingdom. The story became associated with Quin Shin Huangdi because he too had a wall built.
The highlights of the inspection tour were spectacular ceremonies which the emperor staged at the tombs of mythical prehistoric rulers, in order to confirm himself as their legitimate heir. The first emperor placed his dynasty under the protection of the element water. Therefore, the most important sacrificial ceremony was held at the Yellow River. According to ancient Taoist belief, the 5 elements, fire, water, metal, wood and earth, determine all that happens in the course of history. The emperor wanted to use this belief to prove the divine origin of his rule. His theory was that if water extinguishes fire, it was preordained that he would take power. The color black was associated with water, which is why all official robes in the Qin dynasty were black. Flags bearing the emblem of Qin were black and white. As they continued towards the southeast through the former kingdom of Chu, the journey became an incredible strain for everyone involved. It often took them through regions in which the people were starving. In many places, the locals were stripped of their last reserves of food to feed the huge retinue. The emperor's journey left a trail of blood in its wake, from the capital, Xianyang, south to Yui, then northeastwards to Kuaiji, and from there along the coast to what is now Shandong province. After several months on the road, the retinue reached the emperor's favorite area, Langya, in the southern part of Shandong. Here too he had a stele erected, praising his achievements for the empire. Part of it has survived and now stands in Beijing's Museum of Chinese History. It proclaims,
He introduced a standardized system of weights and measures. He has regulated the existence of all living beings. He bathes the affairs of man in a bright light and brings father and son together in harmony. The wisdom, compassion, and justice of his divine self are an ideal and shining example of virtue.
According to the historical records, Quin Shin Huangdi first visited this place in 219 BC. He liked it so much that he stayed for 3 months. On one of its hills he had a palace and the Langya terrace constructed for holding large meetings. In coastal regions alone, he had over 400 palaces built. Palace number 1 in what was then the capital, Xianyang, gives us some idea what these splendid palaces must have looked like. Not much remains of it, for only 3 years after his death it was stormed, looted, and burnt down by insurgents. Only a few objects, like these tiles and some small bronzes, bear witness to the splendor of the building. A poem from a later period says of one of his palaces,
It is so immense that it hides the sun in the sky. Every 5 paces there stands a tower, every 10 a pavilion. Corridors snake through the grounds. The eaves of its roofs point heavenwards like the beaks of birds. Nobody knows how many thousands of courtyards it contains.
These finds alone are sensational. They are the oldest surviving fragments of a Chinese mural. They give us an impression of how grandly Quin Shin Huangdi's palaces were decorated. In order to preserve the few foundation walls which have survived, they were covered with earth after excavation. So today, all that remains of the huge palace is a small green hill surrounded by fields. The curator of the neighboring museum shows us that the floor of tamped earth can still be recognized 2,200 years after it was laid. Was this man a liar? Did Sima Chen perhaps invent the search for the elixir of life and of Chu Fu simply to make fun of the first emperor? This is his version of the story. The emperor wasted millions over several years in the vain hope of finding these wonderful herbs. Here in the idyllic region of Langya, the two men met for the first time, when Chu Fu told the emperor about the islands of the Blessed, on which there was an elixir of life. The emperor ordered him to set off in search of it. During this, the last of his inspection tours, the emperor encountered Chu Fu again. He was very angry because Chu Fu still hadn't found anything after several attempts over 9 years. But Chu Fu managed to convince the emperor that huge whales had prevented him and his team from reaching their destination. Quin Shin Huangdi was obsessed by the idea of an elixir of life. He traveled on impatiently, eager for a solution. Eventually, he had a dream in which he fought with a sea god. A Taoist priest consulted the oracle and advised the emperor to kill a large fish. This, he said, would dispose of the demon which had prevented him from attaining immortality. At the so-called end of the sky, the easternmost point of China, the only place where the emperor is still worshipped as a god, he finally found a fish that seemed large enough. Legend has it that the emperor used a repeat fire crossbow to kill a whale which his followers had driven towards him. Was the way now clear for meeting the immortals? Knowing that Chu Fu now had to set off on a new expedition, the emperor continued his journey. One of the daily destinations was the place from which the story of the Islands of the Blessed originated. Today it's still called Panglai, after one of the 3 islands. Here we found one of the keys to the mysterious story of the elixir of life. What sounds like a fairy tale does in fact have a very simple explanation, although this remarkable discovery wasn't made until relatively recently. Here at Panglai, a mirage can be observed on rare occasions. This discovery explains how the tale of the 3 islands of the Blessed developed, of which the first historian wrote,
They're not very far from human life. The problem is, though, that most of the time whenever a ship is about to reach them, it is caught by the wind and driven away.
Encouraged by this prospect, Chu Fu made the following proposal to the emperor.
In the sea there are 3 sacred mountains called Panglai, Fengchong and Yingchu. Immortals live there. We ask that we be permitted to set off for these islands after a ritual cleansing ceremony with a group of boys and girls.
In the course of our research, we uncovered a great deal of evidence suggesting that Chu Fu's last journey did indeed take place. It appears that he set off with 3,000 boys and girls from Shandong province. They crossed the Yellow Sea and landed on the Japanese island of Kyushu. From there they sailed to Shinku on Honshu Island. Toshio Okuno recently published a book about Chu Fu's stay in Japan.
This tablet depicts Chu Fu landing, showing how he arrived near our Mount Panglai, with 100 people on board each ship, bringing with him various types of grain and household implements.
Japanese historians have discovered that Japanese culture experienced a sudden change in about 200 BC. When Chu Fu and his more than 3,000 companions landed on this stretch of the Pacific coast, the people of Japan were still at the stage of corded wear, the Jomon culture, and living in Stone Age huts such as this. In Xingu, the remains of a house have been found which apparently belonged to Chu Fu. It's therefore assumed that he was buried here. Early each morning, many of Xingu's inhabitants pray at a shrine on the sacred Panglai mountain as a token of respect for Chu Fu, who taught them a particular form of whale hunting. The Chinese Qin symbol, the origin of our word China, can be found everywhere. Here, for example, on a memorial in honor of the first mythical ruler of the Yayoi period. He's none other than Zhu Fu from Qin. Standing on Pang Lai on a clear day, it's possible to see a mysterious, often snow-capped mountain peak in the distance. Some of Zhu Fu's companions set off to reach it. They regarded it as the second of the 3 holy mountains and settled there. Even today, many families living near sacred Mount Fuji have the Chinese character Qin in their names. After leaving the coastal region of Shandong province, the first emperor traveled to Mount Taishan. Since time immemorial, Chinese emperors were expected to climb Taishan and make a sacrifice to the Emperor of the Sky. More than 72 dynastic rulers came here and left inscriptions behind. Quin Shin Huangdi probably had very bad memories of this mountain. During the visit on his 3rd tour of inspection, he ignored warnings by Confucians not to damage the mountain with the wheels of his carriage, and was promptly punished by a severe storm on his way down. 3 pine trees are said to have taken pity on him and sheltered him, whereupon he appointed them ministers of the 5th degree. These 3 trees, planted in 1730, commemorate this event. The sun, Taiyan, represents the strong, bright, positive male principle. The emperor, keen to be close to heaven, had to make a sacrifice to it on Taishan, thereby bringing heaven and earth, yang and yin, into harmony. It's this spiritual harmony on which he based his authority. It was the expression of his mandate from heaven. Only little remains of the stele he had erected on the sacred mountain. It reads,
He inspected all regions of the kingdom, climbed Taishan and gazed to the east.
If, on the other hand, you look to the southwest, you have a wonderful view of the former kingdom of Lu. This was the home of the famous philosopher Confucius, and Confucians were at the center of 2 of the darkest chapters of the emperor's reign. In the year 212 BC, the emperor ordered 460 intellectuals to be buried alive. A year earlier, he had ordered the great burning of books, a decree whereby his subjects were to destroy all written matter within 30 days. A huge operation was mounted, in which every house was searched. Anyone found in possession of a book was branded and sentenced to forced labor. With the exception of books on fortune-telling, medicine and agriculture, all writings from that period were put to the flames. Only the most important philosophical works of the past were kept safely under lock and key in the imperial library at Xianyang. But they too were destroyed at the end of the Qin dynasty, together with the palace itself. It's only because his disciples hid his writings in the Lubi wall that the thoughts of Confucius and his followers have been preserved until today. It's reported that the Chancellor Li Sui had warned the emperor to be particularly careful about the Confucians.
They follow their own teachings, plot secretly together, break the laws and encourage others to do the same. They are not oriented towards the present, rather they study ancient times. They are full of opposition to the emperor and gossip about him in the streets. They lead the masses to spread malicious rumors.
Quin Shin Huangdi and his chancellor rejected Confucian teachings, which were based on human and moral values, and the idea that rulers should lead their subjects by wisdom and example. The emperor and his chancellor believed obedience to the law was the greatest virtue. They regarded man as innately evil and therefore to be ruled by strict laws. But in contrast to the first emperor, sacrifices are still made to Confucius 2,500 years on. Throughout East Asia, he's still honored like a god. It has been said that many Chinese emperors were jealous of the Confucius temple in Chufu, which even today is more beautiful than the Forbidden City in Beijing. The magnificent building, which was built long after the master's death, showed the Son of Heaven all too clearly that the Chinese believed there was a father above him whom they honored as the teacher of 10,000 generations. For this reason, these ornately decorated columns were always covered when an emperor visited the temple. The great burning of books and the murder of the 460 intellectuals was seen by generations of Confucians as proof of the utter contempt which the first emperor felt for them. It's hardly surprising, therefore, that Chinese historians, mainly Confucians, did not have anything good to say about this emperor. When the tour of inspection reached Pingwen, in present-day Hebei province, the emperor suddenly fell ill. Nobody dared tell him the seriousness of his condition because he hated anyone speaking of death in his presence. So the journey was resumed as if nothing had happened. Eventually, however, the emperor realized that he was gravely ill, and he made a fateful error. He sent his most trusted soldier, Meng Yi, the head bodyguard, to the sacred mountain of Taishan. Historians still cannot say what lay behind the emperor's sudden illness. The Taoist priests and soothsayers in the emperor's retinue burnt incense each day and prayed for his speedy recovery. But he was now unprotected and at the mercy of his chief eunuch, his chancellor, and his 18th son, Hu Hai. He dictated a letter to his eldest son and designated heir, Fu Su, in which he was told to organize the funeral ceremony, thereby confirming his accession to the throne. But the chief eunuch never sent this letter.
There is one reason why we may presume that Quin Shin Huangdi was murdered. When he became ill, he sent Meng Yi to Taishan. Sima Chen's historical records state Quin Shin Huangdi became ill and sent Meng Yi to the sacred mountain to pray for him. But he did not return until after the emperor's death.
According to the Chinese calendar, the emperor died at his palace in Shachu, in the center of Hebei province, during a tour of inspection in the 7th month of the year 210 BC. He was 50. The emperor's death is still a mystery today. Was he poisoned by his most trusted men, or did he die a natural death? Sima Chen merely reports that the emperor's letter was forged. It called on his eldest son, Fu Su, and the brave general Meng Tian to commit suicide for failing in their battle against nomadic tribes from the north. Did the historian perhaps fear that Quin Shin Huangdi could become a martyr, the victim of ruthless assassins? The emperor's death was kept secret, and the tour of inspection continued unabated. The chief eunuch and his accomplices waited impatiently to see if the legitimate heir to the throne and the general would follow the order to take their own lives, or whether they would see through this deception. When they reached Baotou, they received the news that the two men had indeed taken their own lives in blind devotion to the emperor. It was therefore decided to head straight back to the capital. The emperor's body began to smell in the summer heat, and it became harder and harder to conceal the fact that he was dead. The procession therefore travelled in the evening and early morning, and a cart laden with salted fish was placed behind the emperor's carriage. It was only when they were approaching the capital, Xianyang, that his death was announced. The funeral ceremonies were prepared under the auspices of the heir apparent Hu Hai. Those of the emperor's countless concubines who had not provided him with a child followed their master to the grave. In 215 BC, a Taoist priest had predicted Qin will be destroyed by Hu. Quin Shin Huangdi therefore did everything in his power to prevent the prophecy from coming true. He sent his eldest son and his best general to the northern border to conduct a gigantic campaign against the nomads, which were called Hu in Chinese. But despite all his efforts, it was his favorite son, Hu, who would make the prediction come true and set the empire on the path to ruin. The fact that the first holy historian, as the Chinese call him, chose not to mention the terracotta army in his historical records at least casts doubt on the completeness and objectivity of his work. When the first of the clay warriors were discovered, it was a sensation in the archaeological world. But there was some doubt as to whether they could have come from the tomb of the first emperor, because it was not thought that potters of the Qin dynasty could produce figures of that size. Professor Yuan Zhongyi, who has led the excavation from the start, thought the work would take 10 to 20 days. He and his colleagues have now been working for over 20 years, and there's still no end in sight.
If all the terracotta warriors and horses are taken together, there are about 8,000 figures. More than 1,000 people must have worked for over 10 years to produce them. Producing one of these figures in a small workshop today would take more than 3 months.
When the body of Quin Shin Huangdi was brought into the capital, his tomb was far from complete. The terracotta army in particular was still feverishly being churned out. Initially, there were to have been 4 huge shafts containing a total of 10,000 warriors. But work was still underway on the 3rd. The 4th was therefore abandoned, half finished. In more than 85 small workshops, the clay was painstakingly kneaded until it was soft, flexible, and free of lumps and air bubbles. The work was divided into many small stages so that the individual steps could even be performed by simple farmers. Molds were produced for the feet, trunk, arms, hands, and head, into which clay was pressed. This ensured that the figures were of similar size and matched each other when placed in formation. Generally, 5 to 10 warriors were produced in each batch. In view of the scale of this operation, which took over 10 years and involved so many people from a wide range of provinces, it would be remarkable if the historian, Sima Chen, truly didn't hear about it. Experts believe the potters used real warriors as models for the terracotta figures. This explains why they look so lifelike. But if thousands of people had posed for these statues, they would have known what was happening and would surely have told their friends and relatives. So how could Sima Chen not have known? Professor Yuan Zhongyi, who heads the excavation, also finds it hard to explain this. He suggests that the terracotta army may not have been anything unusual at that time, although the sheer size of the operation makes this seem unlikely. Evidence of fire and other damage indicate that the tomb was looted and pillaged at the end of the Qin dynasty. It's quite likely that Sima Qian simply didn't want to report about this eighth wonder of the world. Opinions differ about the significance of this unique burial gift. Professor Yuan Zhongyi maintains that the entire tomb is a replica of the capital Xianyang, and that the terracotta army represents the military guard that was indeed stationed outside the city. Other experts believe the clay figures were substitutes for real soldiers, who in ancient times had had to follow their leader to the grave. Is it possible that an emperor for whom millions of people had lost their lives suddenly acted more humanely than his predecessors? Perhaps this vast army is an indication of his fear that the states he had conquered would one day take their revenge on him. In any case, all the figures have a determined expression, as if ready at any moment to strike in the service of their emperor. And in view of the fact that the warriors were brightly painted and carried real weapons, they really would indeed have had a magical effect. There were probably several reasons why Quin Shin Huangdi had the terracotta army erected. On the one hand, it was the expression of the most important aspect of his life, and he may have wanted to be surrounded for all eternity by these symbols of his power. On the other hand, he also had great faith in magic, and may therefore have believed that these lifelike troops would strike fear into his enemies. For more than 2,000 years, people have speculated about what might be found in the 460 by 392 meter tomb under this pyramid-shaped hill. Today, only a few foundation walls remain of the huge necropolis which once surrounded it, but we can presume that a central statue-lined avenue led to the burial mound, as in this tomb from the Han period. Strange mythical beings and animals, as well as statues of guards, were to protect the dead from harm and drive away demons and evil spirits. This double grave of a royal couple in Manshong, dating from a slightly later period, gives a good indication of what Quin Shin Huangdi's mausoleum may have looked like. Here too, an underground palace was hewn deep into the rocky ground, complete with stables, horses and carriages, a huge banquet hall and rooms for private audiences. The burial chambers are located right at the very back. There the dead lie in robes of jade inside a painted coffin. Adjoining rooms contain possessions of which the dead were particularly fond, such as lamps, incense bowls, weapons and jewelry. They also include the Shangxian lamp, one of the most beautiful examples of Han sculpture, its clothing and facial expressions clearly recalling figures from the Qin period. If this double grave contained more than 3,000 valuable objects, what then can we expect to find in the largest grave in Chinese history? Scientists, filmmakers, journalists, businessmen, and even clairvoyants have all voiced their opinions. Innumerable articles have appeared in specialist journals, magazines, and newspapers describing the interior of the grave in great detail. They are all based on Sima Qian's description.
The ceilings are decorated with pictures of the heavens. Below, there is a geographic relief of the earth. The country's rivers, the Yangtze, the Yellow River, and the ocean are depicted in Mercury. Various chambers contain models of palaces, pavilions, and official buildings, valuable vessels, stones, and wonderful treasures. Crossbows with automatic firing mechanisms have been installed to shoot intruders.
With all this talk of immense treasures, it's natural to wonder whether they were not robbed a long time ago. This is a subject which fascinates historians and writers alike, and provides filmmakers with ample material for riveting film plots. The film The Emperor's Warriors gives a vivid impression of the fiendish devices used to protect the Emperor's final resting place. Robbers manage to find a way into the burial chamber, but the sophisticated safety devices give them no chance of stealing the legendary treasure. At various times, from the end of the Qin period right up to the present day, there have been reports that the grave was plundered or even destroyed. But Chinese archaeologists tell us that the mausoleum probably has not been plundered yet. They also say they lack the necessary funds and technical know-how to explore and preserve the huge tomb. Could that just be an excuse? Are they perhaps afraid that someone really has got there before them? In the film, the terracotta warriors come alive to protect the emperor's grave. Are they the crossbows that Sima Chen mentioned? Had he therefore mentioned the terracotta army after all? It's clear that over 7,000 life-size warriors of the first emperor still guard a mystery.